In this video, we're going to introduce the Apostle Paul, and we're going to do it by means of a top 5. Before we do that, however, I want to do two different things here. First, I want to look back at our course thesis because we're sort of at a pivot point in our course, and we're at a pivot point in the New Testament. We dealt with Acts in the last video, and now we're moving to the Apostle Paul, and we're moving into a new genre or a new medium of text. So in our course thesis, we say that the New Testament is a collection of texts of varying genres. So we're dealing we'll be introducing next in the next video the genre that we're going to be dealing primarily with the Apostle Paul. So we're moving from narrative. In the Gospels, we have narratives. I asked you to do a narrative assignment earlier, and we're moving into letters, and we're going to see that the way that sort of communication works in different genres and in different media has a different kind of effect on what is theologically produced, and it sort of affects the way that we read text as well. So to call attention to here, the fact that we're moving into a new genre and we're moving into sort of a new way of thinking about the New Testament, or a new way of engaging the New Testament insofar as we're engaging different kinds of texts at this point. The other thing I wanted to do is remind us of our New Testament timeline that we produced, or we put out there earlier on in the semester. So with this pivot point, we're actually moving backwards in time. So even though we're sort of moving forward in content, and we're moving forward in the New Testament itself, as to when the texts were written, we're moving backwards in time. So as a reminder that Paul has his itinerant ministry around the years 46 to 65, and during this time, while he is sort of spreading the gospel to the ends of the earth, he's writing these letters writing the letters to these various churches that normally he has founded. So with the Gospel of Acts, the book of Acts, we were dealing with a year somewhere around 80 CE. So we're essentially moving back in time 20 to 40 years in our New Testament chronology. And the other thing I want to do here is just make sure we're clear about what sources we have for information about Paul's life. And what I'm going to do is sort of rank these based on what scholars go to in order. What's the most important kind of information we have about Paul's life? So we're going to start with the sort of least important, which is still important for our understanding of Paul, but sort of is given the lowest priority. And what's given the lowest priority is going to be any extra biblical text, non-canonical or paracanonical texts that tell us something about Paul's life. So some things in the New Testament, some things about Paul are not mentioned in the New Testament, such as his death. Remember, the book of Acts ends with Paul in Rome sort of awaiting trial. We don't know what happens to him based on the New Testament. We don't know from any other New Testament texts what happened to Paul, how he died, and so on and so forth. And we have traditions that sort of outside of the New Testament that are still within sort of the sphere of the early church or early Christianity that are going to provide more information about that, sometimes in a sort of romanticized kind of way. So the next best source for information about Paul's life is going to come from the New Testament itself, and it is from the book of Acts. The book of Acts is going to devote half of its material or half of its narrative to the Apostle Paul and to his travels. But as we saw in our New Testament timeline, this is written some 20 to 40 years after Paul's life. This doesn't mean it's necessarily inaccurate historically, or it doesn't accurately represent memories of Paul and his journeys, but it is to say that Acts is written later, and it's written in dramatized form. So while it's a good sort of cache of information about Paul, it's not going to be as good of information, or it's not going to be prioritized as highly as texts that are either written by Paul or texts that are attributed to Paul. And we're going to talk about this distinction between disputed and undisputed letters later on. But there are going to be 6 letters in the New Testament that claim that Paul is their author, but many scholars don't think that Paul actually wrote them. And we'll look at these later on, and we'll talk about this idea of disputed letters and what's called pseudepigraphy later on in our course. But just to sort of put it out there now, the 6 disputed letters are going to be Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, and the pastoral epistles, namely 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And these are going to be our second best source of information about Paul. And they're second best because not all people think this is actually reflecting the voice or the hand of Paul. And so, of course, the best then source of information for understanding the Apostle Paul is going to be those letters that all scholars agree came from Paul's mouth or from Paul's hand. And these are going to, there's 7 of these in the New Testament. These are going to be Romans, the Corinthian correspondence, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. So these are the places that scholars are going to go to say, this is where we're going to get our best information about Paul's life, about Paul's thinking, about Paul's theology. So to get that out there, our New Testament timeline and what places we go to get information about the Apostle Paul, his life, his thinking, and his theology. And then we're going to move to a top 5 here in just a second. But before we move to the top 5, I want you to make a prediction. I want you to, based on your own knowledge, based on sort of what you have seen in this course, maybe based on some reading you have done, I want you to predict the 5 items that you think are going to be in the top 5. And we'll see sort of how much your prediction lines up with what I actually present here in the top 5. So go ahead and pause the lecture here. And you don't have to do this in sort of a full-blown way where you write a sentence and then write an explanation of it. If you just write maybe a sentence or two for 5 different items of what you think might show up in this top 5 here. All right, now that you have done that, let's go ahead and present what we find in the actual top 5 from me. So the first one is that Paul was born and raised a devout Jew. So remember, we've introduced this idea of non-negotiable Jewish beliefs, that monotheism, covenant, and Torah sort of formed this circle. Let's go back. This circle around which what counted as Judaism is sort of, once you start messing with the ideas of monotheism, covenant, and Torah being authoritative, that's when you sort of get into the outer realms outside of Judaism, and maybe would not be considered a Jew anymore. So these beliefs, monotheism, covenant, and Torah, are going to be very central and very core to Paul's ideology, to Paul's theology, even after he has sort of what some people call his conversion experience. We're going to challenge that language, conversion, and think of it more in sort of a terms of a change of worldview or a change of theology. But we'll get to that later on. But the important point to know is that as a Jew, born and raised, Paul is going to have monotheism, covenant, and Torah sort of always on his mind. Number 4, and sort of in some ways, as a result of Paul's devout Judaism, Paul persecuted Christians before having some kind of religious experience. So this is where the language of conversion sometimes comes in with Paul. So Paul has a religious experience of the resurrected Jesus that caused his worldview to be utterly transformed. And so Paul himself tells us on a few different occasions in the undisputed letters, so that best source of information for the life of Paul, that this is the case. So in Galatians 1, Paul is sort of reflecting on his past, and says, I was violently persecuting the church of God and trying to destroy it. And then also this is reflected in the book of Acts, chapter 9, the famous Damascus Road experience. Notice that there is, we often get in the iconography and in the artistic representations of of Paul's Damascus Road experience. We have him falling off a horse. No horse mentioned in Acts chapter 9, but sort of became part of the artistic tradition later on. But this is to say we have in both Acts sort of our third best source for understanding and knowing Paul, and in the undisputed letters, testimony to Paul persecuting the church. And what exactly it was about early Christianity that made Paul persecute it is not entirely clear. But it may have something to do with those core Jewish beliefs that Paul initially thought of the early Jesus movement as sort of challenging one or more of those non-negotiable Jewish beliefs, and saw it as a sort of internal Jewish threat that needed to be stamped out. So number 3 here, Paul's central message was the gospel. This word gospel, euangelion in Greek, is going to show up again and again and again in Paul's letters, and is going to be very central to Paul's thinking. And so what we're going to do here is look at the sort of content of Paul's gospel. And to be clear, when we are talking about Paul's gospel, we are distinguishing from Paul's central message, which is not the literary genre of the Gospels, but is about how the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is relevant to Gentiles. The word gospel quite literally means good news, or orally proclaimed good news, something that is told aloud. So for Paul, he's not thinking of a written account when he talks about Gospels. He's not thinking about the gospel texts as we have them, insofar as those aren't going to be written until after Paul's death. But rather, he's thinking about this central message, the good news about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, which is particularly good news for Gentiles. And here we return to those non-negotiable Jewish beliefs and practices. And so for Paul, he's going to take these non-negotiable Jewish beliefs and add to them the fact of Jesus's life, ministry, death, and resurrection. And when Paul talks about his gospel, we're going to see things like Paul referring to Christ dying for sins in accordance with the scripture. So going back to Torah, that Christ's life is sort of in accordance with those non-negotiable Jewish beliefs. And what that does for Paul is that means that monotheism, covenant, and Torah don't get abandoned. It's not as though these concepts or these important theological pillars of Judaism are no longer relevant for Paul, but rather they get sort of reinterpreted and reimagined on the basis of God's radical action in the life, death, and specifically God's radical action in the resurrection of Jesus. And so what happens for Paul is sort of the boundaries of God's covenantal relationship. So that covenant is still going to be so important for Paul, but the boundaries of it, the circle is redrawn so that all people, Jews and Gentiles, can sort of be included in the worship of the Jewish God. That the covenant, that special relationship between God and Israel, between God and the Jewish people, is then opened up to all people, to Gentiles as well. So for Paul, Jews and Gentiles are going to be such an important topic, as we shall see in his thinking, in his writing, and in his theology. So to sort of put Paul's gospel into bullet point format, and this is necessarily to reduce it. There's more to Paul's gospel than this. But some of the things that we're going to focus on as we talk about Paul over the next couple of weeks is how central the death and particularly the resurrection of Jesus are going to be for Paul. And that for Paul, as for the early Jesus movement, Jesus is going to be exalted to a God-like status. That there is so we think of a high Christology in a book like the Gospel of John, but that's also going to be the case in Paul. That Paul has a sort of very high view of Jesus, and in some places seems to equate Jesus with God, which is one of the things that's going to get the early Jesus movement sort of in trouble with respect to that sphere of Judaism. That the more Jesus begins to be considered a God, or more that is sort of clearly expressed in the early Jesus movement or in early Christianity, the more that starts to challenge that core pillar of monotheism, from the Jewish perspective, that when you sort of have a human figure being exalted to a godlike status, that starts to look to other Jews to not be monotheism anymore. Of course, early Christianity is going to clarify exactly how you can have three persons of one deity, sort of at the Council of Nicaea. But we start to see that development early on, even in the New Testament itself, and even in the New Testament's early writings with the Apostle Paul. So what's going to be important for Paul is that God's decisive action in Jesus' resurrection and an individual and a community's belief in Jesus' lordship and resurrection is going to be what saves a person. And that language of salvation or saving has a number of different sort of nuances in Paul, but to sort of reduce it down, Jesus' resurrection is going to be very important for salvation in Paul. And this is in contrast to works of the law. And again, what exactly works of the law means has sometimes been misunderstood. For Paul, it doesn't seem to mean keeping the 613 precepts of Torah, but it seems to be more about the identity markers of what makes a Jew, something like circumcision or Sabbath observance or observing certain dietary practices, is that those aren't the things for Paul any longer, which gets one into the circle of Judaism or allows one to be in the sphere in which one worships the Jewish God, but rather Jesus' resurrection opens up that possibility to those who don't have those identity markers, those sort of works of the law of circumcision, of dietary laws, or of Sabbath observance. And so as a result, Gentiles can be included as part of God's people without keeping these identity markers and without keeping the various commandments of Torah. And number 2 here, Paul had an itinerant, Gentile, and urban ministry. If you remember back to what we said about Jesus's ministry was itinerant. Jesus traveled around, but Jesus's ministry was a Jewish ministry. So Paul and Jesus are similar insofar as both are traveling around proclaiming some kind of message. But what their message is about is going to be different. For Jesus, it was about the kingdom of God. It was announced primarily to Jews, on some occasions to Gentiles as well. But it was also highly rural. It was sort of in the backwoods of Galilee, as it were. Paul's ministry, in contrast, is going to be itinerant. It's going to be Gentile. It's going to be focused in cities, and it's going to be about the gospel. In that last video in Acts, we looked at the 3 different missionary journeys of Paul, and what we see is that Paul sort of hits major cities. And for many historians, this well explains the sort of rapid spread of Christianity from a very small movement early on to just a few centuries later being the preferred religion of the Roman Empire. So by Paul sort of traveling to cities, sort of establishing the seeds of the early Christian movement in those cities, the gospel and the early Jesus movement is able to spread. And so this is why Paul is often called Christianity's founder. So the sort of trick question that you might ask, in an undergraduate class is, who is Christianity's founder? Who is the one that really starts Christianity? And everyone says Jesus, but the spread of Christianity, so Christianity's founder, really sort of comes from Paul and Paul's work traveling around the Greco-Roman world, sort of planting those seeds that would then later grow into a full-flung movement. And lastly, number 1 here is going to be that 13 letters in the New Testament are attributed to Paul. So that word attributed is carefully chosen. I have not said written here because there is debate, as we noted at the beginning of the lecture, whether or not Paul wrote all of these letters that are attributed to him. So we're going to look later on at these categories of undisputed and disputed. And I mentioned all of these texts earlier in the video at the very beginning of it. And here I put it in a sort of different, visualized a different way. So you can sort of see what's disputed and what's undisputed in a in a column format here. And what you're going to find as you sort of read New Testament scholarship and you read New Testament commentaries and works about Paul is that different scholars of sort of different ideologies are going to take they're going to have different takes on what's undisputed and what is disputed, or what was actually written by Paul and what is not written by Paul. So on the sort of more conservative side, you'll have some scholars that say, well, all of these were probably written by Paul. They all bear Paul's name. All 13 letters are written by Paul. And then on the sort of more liberal or progressive side, or the most liberal, most progressive side, you tend to have those who say, well, Paul only wrote these 7 letters. All of the disputed letters are not written by Paul. Some of them present, some scholars will say sort of harmful ways of thinking that don't really reflect what Paul thought or said or wrote. And then sort of in the middle, you'll have a variety of different takes that some scholars will say, well, Paul wrote all 7 of these and also Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, but not the pastorals. So there's a spectrum of what scholars believe about what Paul wrote and what Paul didn't wrote. And they make these determinations largely on 2 different things. One is linguistic style, comparing the disputed letters and the undisputed letters as to sort of how Paul writes or how Paul dictates a letter. And when you compare certain letters side by side, some look more similar to one another and some don't look like the others, so the old Sesame Street activity, one of these things is not like the other. When you compare some of the undisputed letters, they're missing sort of characteristic Pauline vocabulary or Paul's sort of syntax, the way he normally writes. And this is explained in a number of different ways that we'll address later on in the course. And then the other reason that some of these letters get disputed is because of the content in them, that they don't reflect what we see in the letters that all agree are written by Paul. There's sort of some outlier themes in the disputed letters, and in particular disputed letters, so that in something like 2 Thessalonians, you're going to see words and issues raised that are totally unique to that letter. So all of this to say that those letters that are disputed and thought by some scholars not to be written by Paul are that disputation happens on these 2 primary counts, which we'll talk about as we move forward in the course.